We're currently seeing tech stocks at new highs, gold at new highs, the Dow Jones at new highs, real estate at new highs, the S&P at new highs, and even commodities like silver going parabolic towards current all-time highs. So why is it Bitcoin has not made a new high for weeks and has been stagnating in the same range since early July? So we'll get straight into it here on the Whale Shadows chart we have here on BitcoinMagazinePro.com. And what we can see is the whale shadows have been very much trending to the upside over the past few weeks. If you isolate by pretty much any age band, what you can see is they're generally trending in an upwards direction. We had a period of very low whale shadows, a very low amount of revived supply just a few months ago as Bitcoin dipped towards $74,000, $75,000. But recently we've actually begun seeing pretty much all of these different age bands very much increasing in parallel. And if you add all of them to the chart, you can again see that pretty much all of these are showing that there's a huge amount of whale activity, large whales taking action on Bitcoin, moving their Bitcoin after multiple years. And these aren't just small transactions. These are transactions of at least 100 Bitcoin being moved. And I would just like to clarify, I am in casual shirt, but that's not because it's a casual week. I actually got pretty horrifically sunburnt, so I'm all cling filmed up under the shirt. Don't think that this is a bearish video because I'm not wearing the uniform. It's more of a necessity than a choice. But what we can see by looking at this is this certainly isn't great. As soon as we see hundreds, if not thousands of Bitcoin being moved by some of Bitcoin's longest and largest holders after years of inactivity, historically this has actually pretty often coincided with Bitcoin market peaks. I mean, if I just look at the 4 to 5 year age bands here and then look at how that correlates and how that actually overlays onto price action, again, we can see we usually get these big clusters of whale selling as the Bitcoin price is typically approaching a Bitcoin market cycle peak. Now, can we say that the same is true for this time? Well, what we can do is if we go over to here, which is just on a Google Sheet using the Bitcoin Magazine Pro API, what we can actually do is look at the data a little bit more closely, a little bit more in depth. I'm just gonna move myself over here so it's a little easier to see. Rather than just looking at the raw whale shadows value, we need to take a little bit of a more nuanced look at it. What we can do is actually look at the different age bands, the amount of whales, shadows, transactions, revived supply that are actually being moved and transferred on chain. But rather than just looking at the pure raw data, which is evolving, it's changing. The Bitcoin supply and demand economics of the network are dynamic. They're constantly changing. The fundamentals of ETFs, institutions, treasury companies all arriving, potentially buying to never actually move or transfer or sell that Bitcoin again, is obviously having an impact on just investor behavior. And again, if you look back a few years when Bitcoin was a little bit more utilized, maybe people were transferring Bitcoin a little bit more frequently, whereas these days where it kind of has more of a store of value narrative, again, we maybe need to slightly shift our perception, how we're actually taking into account some of these metrics. And this is why they pay me the big bucks, because we can look at these metrics, look at the thousands of lines of code. I've had to scroll through and all the data to actually get all of this. But what we can see here is rather than just looking at the amount of whale shadows transactions, if I just click on this here, what I can do is change it so you can see if we aggregate all of these whale shadows. So rather than just isolating by different age bands, if I add on, for example, this here, which is the total whale transactions, so we can see all of the whale transactions absolutely aggregated. So if we just quickly go back here, rather than just looking at the 4 to 5 and the 5 to 7, the 7 to 9, 10 plus all individually, if we collate them all together, we get this red line, which is the total amount of revived supply whale shadow transactions. And again, it paints a very similar picture where if we just highlight on the chart, usually we see these big spikes occurring at market cycle peaks, and this is averaged out over a 28-day period or 4-week period, so we can kind of get a little bit more of a smoothed view of this, and there's not so many individual transactions or individual days or big whales so much influencing the data. We can again see that these usually occur as the Bitcoin price is not always topping out. We can see, for example, in this instance, in the tail end of the 2018 bear cycle, we had a huge amount of whale transactions. Again, potentially pointing towards capitulation there. But throughout this cycle as well, we've had multiple different instances as Bitcoin has found local peaks of whales having these big periods of lots of Bitcoin being transferred. But like I said, we need to take a slightly more nuanced view of this. I did kind of spoil it by already having it loaded up on the chart. But if I just hide this again and show the percentage of Bitcoin supply that is actually being held by these whales. So rather than just looking at the pure amount of Bitcoin being transferred, if we take into account the percentage of that is the circulating supply, then it's slightly changed it. It doesn't look quite as worrying. Now, this isn't a perfect interpretation of the data because what I'm using here is the amount of addresses holding at least 100 Bitcoin. So this is the percentage of circulating supply compared to the amount of Bitcoin being held by addresses in 100 wallets, but those addresses could hold anywhere from 100 to a million Bitcoin in their wallet. So again, this is almost a most conservative estimate of this. But what we can see is looking at this data here, if I can load it up on the chart, there's still a lot of parallels. We do still see significant spikes to the upside as Bitcoin is at these points of market peaks or even market bottoms, just huge amounts of sustained volatility. When we see Bitcoin have these big, massive exponential moves, all these big, crazy capitulation event sell-offs, we do still see this, even when looking at it as a percentage rather than raw values, still having a big parallel to Bitcoin's biggest moves and local peaks and bottoms in price action. However, once again, we can take this a step further because you also need to take into consideration that while again we could see a huge amount of Bitcoin being transferred in a very short space of time by a huge amount of wallets, especially when looking at that as a comparison of the circulating supply of Bitcoin, we also need to take into account that this may be warped by just one or two whales that are transferring huge amounts of Bitcoin. So there could be a Bitcoin address that holds 10,000 Bitcoin and they're just selling 100 clips of Bitcoin every day, every few hours potentially. So what we can do is actually look at the amount of unique transactions by different whales. So what I've done is again go onto the blockchain, look at all the different blockchain data. So here we can see the actual raw amount of whale transactions per day and how that relates to the Bitcoin price. And again, what we actually see here is a slightly more accurate, I'll say, a slightly more parallel correlation between the Bitcoin price action and these transactions. We can see in 2017, for example, even though if we just scroll back up, we had a lot of transactions on this day, we had a lot of Bitcoin being moved. If we actually scroll down, we can see that the amount of different individual unique whales that were transferring was significantly higher. And if we look at something like the tail end of that 2018 bear cycle, while we did have a slight uptick in this data, it was nothing compared to the massive upticks we usually see at Bitcoin cycle peaks, or at least local peaks in price action, which gives us some indication that while we did see a huge amount of Bitcoin being transferred, it was almost entirely from a small number of whales, indicating that just a few individuals almost entirely capitulated, which slightly warped this data. And we can see that just looking at the number of transactions actually looks to be incredibly accurate, more so than just looking at the raw amount of Bitcoin being transferred. Again, strength in numbers. If we just look at one individual, one big Bitcoin holder, looking at their transactions, looking at their transfers, they might not be very good at timing the market. They may be capitulating at bottoms, buying a huge amount of Bitcoin OTC at market peaks. So when we actually take a look at a huge amount of whales, when we're aggregating hundreds, if not thousands of different addresses to look in when they're transferring and looking at that strength in numbers and looking at that market impact, not by just by one individual who could potentially see their buys or sells being absorbed by a huge amount of new participants. When we look at massive amounts of Bitcoin being moved by mass amounts of users, this gives us a much clearer indication. And what we can see at the minute, even though we have seen recently a big peak in this amount of Bitcoin being sold, and when we look at the whale shadows, we can see a huge amount of whale activity. When we actually take a look at the percentage of the circulating supply, this is actually massively reduced over the past few weeks. And when we take a look at the raw number of individual whale transactions happening, this has been massively decreasing over the past few weeks, which indicates even though we have seen a lot of whale activity on chain recently, it looks like it's not actually by a huge amount of individual whales, and it looks like it's not accounting for a huge amount of the circulating supply. Just the dynamics of Bitcoin have shifted, so more Bitcoin is being held by these long-term whales, and it looks like fewer and fewer of them are actually transferring it. But what we can do is take it a step further. So what we can do is multiply. So if we're looking at the percentage of the circulating supply of these large transactions happening and the amount of individual transactions, if we kind of multiply them, we can kind of see how much Bitcoin per transaction, per big transaction, when looking at the relationship to the circulating supply, to give us a little bit more of an even more accurate outlook on the market. Feels like I'm talking in percentages a lot. I think I'm just a little bit sunburnt. I think going a little bit crazy here. What we can see looking at this chart, which again shows us something pretty similar, let's be honest. What we can see is we see big amounts of whale activity, a huge number of whales transferring a huge amount of Bitcoin again, at these big peaks in market price action. We do still see some upticks at capitulation events, but this is going to be slightly warped by a small number of whales transferring a huge amount of Bitcoin. But again, what we can see is even though in this cycle we have had multiple peaks of these higher regions, recently we have actually seen a little bit of a change of trend in this direction, and it is starting to cool off a little bit. But what you can do just looking at a data point like this, if we were to draw something along the lines of this, when we start crossing above this level, it does usually indicate that we're getting to a point of a local peak in price action. We can see in the 2017 cycle, this pretty much marked the peak to perfection. In the previous cycle, it marked the first run up to we had $40,000. And then again, as we've regained $60,000 after we rebounded from that dip. And then as we actually rebounded in the price during this start, the early stage of this bear cycle, we again saw a lot of whales potentially realizing they'd missed the peak, saw this double top price action and begun offloading on the first bounce we got. And in this cycle, as we first round at $73,000, $74,000 post ETF announcement, and again, you do have to consider that a certain amount of these Bitcoin whale transactions will have been those transferring potentially into ETFs just for ease of use, for tax reasons, whatever it may be. So again, we can't really map that out directly, but we can say that there will be some influence of that. And again, as we first passed $100,000, and recently, which is why we've been at an equilibrium, we have seen a lot of whale transactions happening on the network. But like we could see, it's not by a huge amount of different whales, so I don't think that is anything to be immediately worried about. And what we can see is the reason that we haven't seen a big crash, because realistically, at any other point in Bitcoin's history, if we saw such sustained selling, such huge amount of Bitcoin being moved, that would almost certainly result in a 20, 30, 40, 50% pullback in the Bitcoin price action. Well, thankfully, we're seeing hundreds of millions of US dollars and thousands of Bitcoin being accumulated by the ETS. So just to summarize, Bitcoin seems to be the only asset that isn't rallying hard and at new all-time highs. Equities, commodities, real estate, etc. have all had an almost parabolic move in recent months, while BTC is at the same price since it was in July. But looking at the number of whale transactions happening on the Bitcoin network outlines how the supply and demand economics of Bitcoin are currently at an equilibrium. We're seeing thousands of Bitcoin being sold by large and long-term holders without a real sustained influx of new buyers. Realistically, if we were seeing the ETFs buying up substantially more than the treasury companies continuing to buy tens of thousands of Bitcoin, as well as retail coming into the market, then we wouldn't be at these prices, we would be at new all-time highs. But realistically, we're at the same price as July because the amount of Bitcoin that's been transferred onto the chain, sold onto the chain, has only just about been matched by the amount of Bitcoin that's actually being bought. However, what we can see is a lot of this selling has actually been coming from just a smaller number of whales, and what we're actually seeing is that trend actually going to the downside. We're seeing this amount of Bitcoin being transferred start to diminish. So this looks very dissimilar to the level of profit taking, the pattern of profit taking we see towards Bitcoin cycle peaks. And if we are to see a little bit of a slowdown in the selling and a rotation from other markets, considering they're all pretty much at all-time highs, then Bitcoin could be primed to finally start following in the footsteps of pretty much all of the markets. If you like this video, then please visit bitcoinmagazine.pro.com, where our analytics help you to cut through the noise to make informed, data-driven decisions about Bitcoin. With over 150 live charts, personalized indicator alerts, in-depth crypto industry reports, API access, and more for a fraction of the standard industry price. And let me know what your thoughts are on Bitcoin whales taking some profit up here. Do you think it's wise to do that? Do you think that this is going to result in a Bitcoin market peak if we do see traditional markets starting a more sustained pullback? Or do you think that this is just a temporary amount of selling and this is starting to come to an end and we are about to see a bit more of a big capital rotation into BTC? And let me know what your thoughts are on the shirt. It was just a few quid and it came with matching trousers, actually. I'm not sure if you can see them. So yeah, let me know your thoughts on Sunburn and anything else that you think about, really. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.